They found his teeth before they found his name. A grim discovery on a rainy night, in a forgotten alley behind the Lower East Side. Broken glass reflected the dim streetlights as a silhouette crouched over the gruesome find. Detective Sal Russo, a man hardened by decades in New York's darkest corners, whispered, "Who leaves a man like this?" The city's underbelly, usually silent after midnight, now screamed secrets. The rain mingled with the blood as the cold wind carried echoes of betrayal. Somewhere nearby a phone rang, sharp, urgent. It was a scream, a woman's voice breaking the silence with the agony of loss. Maria DeLuca, sister to the missing man, dropped the receiver, trembling. Her brother's silence had ended, but the nightmare was just beginning. Every shadow in that alley seemed to pulse with danger. The streets had taken something from them all, but tonight, the bloodline's darkest secret was bleeding through the cracks. Maria's hands shook as she dialed the number again, desperate for answers no one could give. "Tell me where he is," she pleaded into the static. The line was cold. The city outside her window felt indifferent, its heart beating fast but without mercy. Detective Russo arrived at the precinct, the weight of the case settling on his shoulders like a storm cloud. The files on the desk told stories of missing men and whispered threats, names crossed out and replaced with others. The underworld's silence was breaking. A phone rang abruptly, cutting through the tension. "We found more," a voice said, cold and clipped. The family's silence was cracking, and with it, the truth clawed its way out of the shadows. The city breathed darkness as rumors spread through whispered calls and nervous glances. In a smoky backroom of an Italian restaurant, Johnny Knuckles Carbone, a man in his early 40s with a scarred face and cold eyes, listened carefully. "The DeLuca boy's gone missing. Blood on the streets. Someone's stirring the hornet's nest," he muttered. Loyalty was a fragile thing here, shifting like the shadows cast by flickering candles. Across town, a young street kid watched from a rooftop, his eyes sharp with fear and curiosity. He knew secrets weren't safe in New York, especially when the family's past was bleeding into the present. Every step, every breath was a calculated risk. Maria paced her cramped apartment, the weight of silence pressing down like a noose. Her father, the family's once feared Don, had vanished years ago, leaving only whispered legends and broken promises. Now, the silence was louder than ever. She clutched a faded photograph of her brother smiling, before the streets took him. Her phone lit up. An unknown number. "We're watching," a distorted voice said. "Don't look back." Fear twisted inside her, but anger burned brighter. The family bloodline was fighting to survive, and Maria was ready to bleed for it. Outside, the city's lights flickered uncertainly, reflecting the storm brewing inside her heart. The clock struck midnight as Detective Russo stepped out into the slick streets, the city's heartbeat syncing with his own. The case had morphed from a simple missing person to something darker, deeper, a family secret buried beneath layers of blood and lies. He paused under a flickering street lamp, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. Somewhere a whispered warning sliced through the night. "They're watching. They're waiting." The cold air carried the scent of rain and menace. This was only the beginning. The bloodline's silence had shattered, and now the city's shadows were alive with the promise of reckoning. Though the darkness took them, they were ordinary. Maria was a bright-eyed girl with dreams too big for her Brooklyn neighborhood. Her brother, Tony, a promising kid with a laugh that could fill a room, was never meant to disappear into the city's shadows. The DeLuca family name once carried respect and fear in equal measure, but years of silence had hollowed out their legacy. Maria remembered her father's words, "Blood ties don't break easily, but silence can kill." Tony's last night alive was etched in her mind, laughter turning into fear, promises turning into threats. The streets didn't just take her brother, they stole her innocence. Now, every heartbeat echoed with the ache of loss and a fire that demanded justice, no matter the cost. Tony was more than just a brother. He was a loyal soldier to the family, caught between love and loyalty in a world built on fragile trust. His friends remembered him as tough but kind-hearted, a protector of those who couldn't protect themselves. But the streets whispered darker stories. Of debts unpaid, warnings ignored. Maria's mother spoke little of Tony now, her grief a silent fortress. Loyalty in the family was currency, but it came with a steep price. As Maria pieced together the fragments of Tony's last days, she saw the cracks in their foundation, the lies told to keep peace, the sacrifices buried deep. She wondered if loyalty was a chain or a shield, and if her brother had been broken trying to hold it all together. In the underground, loyalty was tested with every whispered deal and every glance over the shoulder. Frankie the Razor, a grizzled man in his 60s and Tony's mentor, spoke of days when the family was untouchable. "We ruled these streets with iron and respect," he said, voice rough with regret. But power had a cost, and old alliances crumbled like brittle glass. Tony's disappearance sent ripples through the ranks, shaking those who had long relied on silence to survive. Frankie's eyes, hardened by decades, betrayed a flicker of fear. The family's strength had always been its unity, but now the streets smelled blood, and not just Tony's. The fragile ties that bound them were unraveling, and the truth was ready to ignite a war. Maria's own resolve hardened as the nights grew colder and the silence louder. She wasn't just a sister seeking answers. She was a daughter of a dawn, born into a legacy of secrets and blood debts. She moved through the city like a ghost, visiting old allies and long-forgotten haunts. Each encounter revealed pieces of a puzzle no one dared to solve openly. "The streets don't forget," warned Luca, a mid-30s enforcer with sharp eyes and a scar along his jaw. "But some memories want to die." Maria's hands clenched into fists. She understood that the family's past was both a shield and a cage. To survive, she would have to confront not just enemies, but the ghosts of her own bloodline, and the sacrifices it demanded. The city itself seemed to pulse with the stories Maria uncovered, whispers of deals gone wrong, names erased from ledgers, and faces turned away when her family was mentioned. She learned that every street corner held a secret, every handshake a hidden agenda. The ache of loss was a constant companion, but it fueled her fight. "This isn't just about Tony anymore," she told herself. "It's about the family and what it costs to be loyal." As dawn broke over the skyline, Maria knew the path ahead was dark and uncertain. But blood called for blood, and the silence that once protected her family was now their greatest vulnerability. The fight for truth had only just begun. The money was gone. The loyalty was gone. Now all Tony had was the gun. Rumors swirled like smoke in the air, thick and choking. Deals meant to keep peace shattered overnight. The DeLuca crew splintered. Old friends turned into cautious enemies. Detective Russo watched the chaos unfold, knowing the city's law was fragile here. A meeting at the docks exploded into a firefight, shattering silence and glass alike. Johnny Knuckles Carbone cursed under his breath. "We're falling apart." Every betrayal echoed in the cold rain, dripping into the gutters like blood. Families fractured, alliances dissolved, and the streets weren't forgiving. The game had changed, and no one was safe anymore. The cops were closing in. Surveillance cameras blinked from every corner, eyes unblinking and cold. Frankie, the Razor, knew the walls were closing, but he refused to surrender. "We stick to the shadows or we're dead," he growled. Plans were hurriedly rewritten in smoke-filled rooms, whispered in nervous tones. Maria's phone buzzed endlessly with warnings and threats. The crew's foundation was cracking fast. Some vanished into the night, others disappeared without a trace. Every ally was a potential enemy, and every street corner a trap. The city's pulse grew frantic as the noose tightened, leaving only desperate choices. Survival wasn't about strength, it was about who betrayed first. Maria's lover vanished without a word, swallowed by the chaos they'd unleashed. She felt the sting of betrayal firsthand, the loneliness sharper than any gunshot. "He was my anchor," she whispered to the empty room. Trust fractured with every passing day, replaced by paranoia and silent accusations. The family's enemies sensed weakness and moved in. "Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer," Maria remembered her father's cold advice, but it felt hollow now. The streets she'd once known turned hostile, every shadow concealing danger. With every heartbeat, she realized this fight wasn't just for blood or power, it was for survival itself. Deals dissolved into gunfire, and old friends turned into cold rivals overnight. Luca, the enforcer with the scar, was missing, vanished like a ghost. Tensions exploded in a warehouse showdown that left no room for mercy. "You cross us, you're dead," a voice hissed through the smoke and chaos. Blood-stained concrete floors, promises shattered like glass underfoot. The family's grip on the street slipped dangerously. Frankie's words echoed, "Loyalty is a lie if it costs your life." The city's underworld was a powder keg, lit by fear and desperation. And somewhere in the shadows, someone was pulling strings, waiting for the explosion. The fallout was brutal. Maria's family was fractured, alliances shattered beyond repair. Streets once ruled by whispered respect, now echoed with gunshots and sirens. Detective Russo stood amid the wreckage, watching as old power crumbled and new dangers rose. "This city eats its own," he muttered. The price of survival was rising. Betrayals, broken oaths, lives lost. As dawn approached, Maria vowed vengeance and justice. The hell unleashed wasn't just chaos, it was a reckoning. The DeLuca bloodline faced extinction or domination, and the coming days would decide which. The son was a snitch. Nobody wanted to believe it. Tony, the loyal brother, the soldier who stood by his family. But whispers turned into confessions in shadowed corners. Luca, once trusted enforcer, revealed his allegiance to the feds, trading blood for freedom. He wasn't after money. Maria's voice trembled as she confronted the truth. "He was after me." The betrayal cut deeper than any bullet. The family's foundation cracked under the weight of treachery. Detective Russo's eyes darkened as he processed the fallout. Loyalty was a fragile myth, shattered by one man's greed. The devil was no stranger, he had worn the face of family all along. Maria's world unraveled like a tapestry torn at its seams. The wife she trusted had made the call, sending the family spiraling into chaos. Her voice on the phone was cold and precise, a death sentence wrapped in calm. "He's not coming back," the whisper said. Maria felt rage ignite inside her, a fire hotter than grief. The streets seemed to close in tighter, and every shadow hid a potential threat. Trust was a currency long spent. Family dinners now held empty seats, and every smile carried suspicion. She realized vengeance wasn't just personal, it was survival. The war was no longer just about blood, but about who could wield betrayal as their weapon. Frankie, the razor, was caught between old loyalties and new dangers. His weathered hands clenched a worn photograph of the DeLuca patriarch, memories of better times haunting his gaze. "We were kings once," he muttered. But the crown had slipped, and the crownless bled in silence. The family's fractures deepened as mistrust spread like wildfire. Frankie knew survival meant ruthless choices. Some lives were expendable, some secrets unbearable. He stepped into the night, ready to face enemies old and new, carrying the weight of the past and the threat of a future soaked in blood. The devil's price was due, and it was coming for them all. The city's underworld was a chessboard, and Maria moved like a queen, sharp and unpredictable. Each move revealed new players, new threats lurking beneath familiar faces. She found herself trapped in a web of deceit where allies could turn, and enemies could bleed for a cause. "Every secret has a price," Luca warned, eyes hard as steel. Maria's own heart wavered between vengeance and survival. She faced impossible choices, whether to trust the broken or embrace the darkness she feared. The family's legacy was no longer a shield, it was a battlefield. And the devil lurking in the shadows was ready to strike the final blow. Betrayal was not the end, it was only the beginning. As the family's secrets spilled into the open, violence erupted with brutal finality. The son's treachery sparked a chain reaction that would consume friend and foe alike. Detective Russo realized this was no longer a case. It was a reckoning. The bloodline's sins had come home to roost, and the streets would burn to settle old debts. Maria, hardened but broken, stood ready to face the devil she never saw coming. "He wasn't after money," she whispered again. "He was after me." The game had changed, and the players would pay with blood. The final betrayal came like a thunderclap. Maria stood in the shadowed chapel, the place where family secrets were buried beneath cold marble. The funeral was in full swing, faces masked in grief and suspicion. She wore the same suit she had argued about for weeks, sharp and somber. The man she once trusted approached, a cold smile twisting his lips. "You never should have doubted me," he said, voice low and dangerous. A single shot echoed, sharp and final. The room froze, time splintering into silence and chaos. Maria's heart thundered, vengeance and ruin entwined in that moment. The bloodline's reckoning was here, and nothing would be the same again. Gunpowder smoke hung thick as bodies fell, and screams pierced the night. The funeral turned battlefield shattered the fragile peace, every gunshot a scream for justice or revenge. Detective Russo, caught in the storm, moved with purpose, his badge a fragile shield against the madness. Maria's eyes burned with fury and pain, her hands trembling but steady. Every shot fired was a piece of her soul breaking free, a declaration that the family bloodline would not be buried in silence. The streets outside waited, hungry for the fallout, while inside, the blood spilled like a river no one could stop. This was more than war. It was a reckoning written in fire and blood. Amidst the chaos, Maria faced Luca, her betrayer and once trusted enforcer. "You chose death," she said, voice cutting through the smoke. Luca's eyes flashed with fear and defiance. The floor beneath them was slick with blood and broken promises. Every breath was a countdown, every heartbeat a fuse. The clash was brutal and raw, a fight not just for survival, but for the soul of the family. When the final shot rang out, it wasn't just a bullet, it was a release. The battlefield stilled. Maria stood over the ruin, victorious but hollow. The cost was unbearable, but the reckoning was complete. The dust settled, but the price was clear. Friends lay fallen, alliances shattered like fragile glass. Maria's breath came heavy, her hands stained with more than just blood. Detective Russo approached quietly, his expression grave but respectful. "You did what had to be done," he said. But Maria knew it was more than survival, it was transformation. The family's legacy was rewritten in ashes and fire. There was no going back, no returning to the life before the bloodshed. She looked out the chapel's stained glass, the rising sun bleeding through, a fragile hope in the crimson light. The war was over, but the scars would last forever. The bloodline's reckoning had come at a terrible cost. Maria's victory was a double-edged sword, her family avenged, but her soul forever marked. The city outside woke to a new order forged in fire and betrayal. She knew the streets would never forget this night, nor would they forgive. As the first light of morning touched the skyline, Maria whispered a silent promise. This is not the end. The legacy of blood and silence would continue, but on her terms. The ashes of ruin held the seeds of revenge, and the fight was far from over. The city moved on, but Maria never did. She sat alone in the quiet of her apartment, the weight of the past pressing on her like a silent ghost. The bloodshed had ended, but the scars remained, etched deep in her soul. Every creak, every shadow, reminded her of what was lost. The family she once knew was gone, replaced by a legacy written in silence and regret. Detective Russo's last words echoed in her mind. There's no retirement plan for ghosts. She had paid the price for vengeance, but the cost was more than she had imagined. The silence was deafening, and the fight for peace had only just begun. Detective Russo stood at the edge of the Hudson River, watching the city skyline flicker like a distant flame. The case was closed, but the city never truly forgave. His badge felt heavier now, a reminder of promises broken and justice deferred. He thought of Maria and the bloodline that had fought so fiercely and lost pieces of themselves along the way. "Justice is a long shadow," he whispered. He turned away from the water, knowing the streets held more secrets than any single case could solve. The price of silence was eternal vigilance, and he was ready to pay it. Maria returned to the streets she once feared, walking with quiet determination. The family's power was fractured, but the legacy lingered like smoke on the wind. Old allies offered cautious nods, enemies gave wary glances. She knew the silence she'd inherited was not peace, it was a warning. Every step she took was measured, every word weighed. The city's pulse beat beneath her feet, a constant reminder that survival was never guaranteed. Her fight had become a vigil, guarding the fragile line between life and oblivion. The bloodline story was far from over. In a small family-owned cafe, Maria met with old friends and remnants of the crew, faces marked by hardship and hope. The conversation was quiet but loaded, plans whispered, alliances cautiously rebuilt. The price of survival was vigilance and sacrifice, and they all paid in kind. Maria spoke softly but with resolve. "We'll carry the past, but we choose the future." The streets outside buzzed with life, unaware of the fragile peace inside. For now, the family held together, fragile as it was. But the shadows never truly disappeared, they only waited. The final truth settled like dust over the city. The family's silence had a price, and it was paid in blood and broken dreams. Maria looked out from her apartment window as the city stirred to life below, a silent sentinel watching over the streets she once feared. Her voice was a whisper in the wind. There's no retirement plan for ghosts. The bloodline's legacy would live on, haunted, hardened, but unbroken. The fight had changed her, but it had not defeated her. The shadows held their secrets, but Maria held the will to face them. The silence was no longer empty. It was a promise. The city's heartbeat slowed but never stopped. Maria stood at the edge of the Brooklyn Bridge, watching dawn break over the river. The fight had carved deep lines into her face, but her eyes held a flicker of something new, resilience born from pain. She whispered to the wind, "There's no retirement plan for ghosts." The bloodline's silence had been shattered, but it had left a legacy, one of survival and sacrifice. The ghosts of the past walked beside her, reminders of the price paid. But as the city stirred awake, so did a fragile hope. The fight had changed her, but it had not broken her. This was the dawn of a new chapter. Friends had fallen, enemies vanished, but the story was far from over. Maria's voice was steady as she met with old allies in a quiet cafe, their faces marked by time and battle. "We survived the storm," she said. "Now we rebuild." The city outside bustled with oblivious energy, unaware of the fragile peace forged in shadows. Every scar told a story, every silence held a secret. The family's legacy was no longer just blood, it was strength forged through fire. As they planned the future, Maria understood that survival was not just about vengeance, it was about hope, however fragile. The city's streets pulsed with new rhythms, but the shadows lingered. Maria walked the alleys she once feared, her steps confident and measured. Every corner held memories, every whisper a warning. She knew the silence could return if she let her guard down. The fight for truth and justice was endless in a city built on secrets. But Maria carried a promise: no more ghosts, no more silence. She would face the shadows head-on with the strength of those who came before her, and the will to carve her own path. The final truth was simple, yet profound. The price of silence was eternal vigilance. Maria sat in her apartment, the city lights casting dancing reflections on the walls. She lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward like the memories she could never forget. "This city doesn't forgive," she murmured. The bloodline's legacy was now hers to protect, a burden heavy but honored. The scars she bore were reminders of the cost, but also of the resilience that defined her family. The silence was broken, but the watch would never end. For Maria, this was both an end and a beginning. As the city's neon lights flickered into the late hours, Maria stood on her balcony, the skyline stretching endlessly before her. She whispered a final vow to the night: The silence is no longer empty, it's a promise. The bloodline story would live on, haunted, hardened, but unbroken. The ghosts might never rest, but neither would she. The streets were alive with secrets, but Maria was ready to face them all. This was her city, her family, her fight. And as the first light of dawn approached, she knew the legacy of blood and silence was only just beginning.